They say history is written by the victors. But in the pages of Scripture, some stories were never erased. They were simply buried, hidden beneath layers of genealogy, swallowed by the dust of forgotten desert and overshadowed by louder promises. Yet God never forgets what He speaks, and what He speaks, He fulfills, even if the world forgets to look for it. This is the story of 12 sons, not of Jacob, but of Ishmael, the firstborn of Abraham, a boy born not through covenant, but through conflict. His name means God hears. And that was no accident, because long after he was cast into the wilderness, heaven still listened. You've heard of the 12 tribes of Israel. But how many sermons, how many lessons, how many maps have ever pointed you toward the 12 tribes of Ishmael? Who were they? Where did they go? And what if their story was not a side note, but a sacred thread woven deep into the fabric of biblical prophecy? For centuries, theologians have debated Ishmael's role. Some call him the wild man. Others call him the forsaken. But the truth is far more complex. His descendants shaped empires, traded spices across ancient lands. Their names appear in the records of Assyrian kings, carved in stone and carried in blood. Yet in the modern world, their identity remains a mystery. A mystery the Scriptures never fully closed. So why has the church remained silent? Why do we speak so often of Isaac and so little of the brother who came before? This is not just a historical question. It is a spiritual mirror. What happens when we confuse silence with absence? And what happens when God remembers a promise we have forgotten? In this journey, we will trace the hidden lines of 12 tribes across the sands of Arabia. We will uncover the symbolism in their names, their rise and disappearance, their prophetic shadow over the future. And most of all, we will ask what their legacy says about a God who hears even those cast away. Let us begin with the first son, the first promise, the first tribe, the birth of Ishmael, a son not forgotten. Before there was Isaac, there was Ishmael. His story does not begin in joy, but in tension. In the tents of Abraham's faith and frustration wrestled beneath the same roof. Years passed, promises lingered, and the silence of an empty womb grew heavier than the desert night. Then came Hagar, the Egyptian maidservant, not chosen by covenant, but chosen by circumstance. And from her came Ishmael, Abraham's firstborn, a son not born of promise, but not outside the reach of God. When Hagar fled into the wilderness, broken and despised, an angel met her by a spring of water. There, in the harshness of exile, the God of eternity revealed himself with tenderness. He did not offer escape, but prophecy. He named the unborn child Ishmael. God will hear. Not only had heaven seen her suffering, it had already named her son with divine purpose. This was not the end. It was the beginning of a legacy born through rejection, but destined for remembrance. Ishmael was not the mistake. He was the message, a living contradiction, human impatience wrapped in divine compassion. Though Sarah would one day give birth to Isaac, the boy born first would never be unseen. For even when the tents closed their doors and the camp pushed him away, God heard him cry under a bush in the wilderness. And he answered. There, under a dry tree in a forgotten place, water flowed again. And a covenant was whispered into the wind. Not the covenant of nations chosen, but of nations multiplied. Ishmael was not the heir of the altar, but he was still a child of the voice. And in God's voice, there is always room for the ones we cast out. In the silence of that desert spring, a question still lingers. If God saw the abandoned, what else have we failed to see? What other promises wait quietly in the corners of our theology, unheard but not forgotten? The forgotten covenant, a blessing, parallel to Isaac's. It is easy to forget a promise when it is not your own. Easier still when that promise is made to the one you would rather forget. But God does not divide his attention by human preference. In Genesis 17, after speaking of Isaac's coming birth, God turns to Abraham and says something astonishing. "As for Ishmael, I have heard you. I have blessed him. I will make him fruitful. He shall father 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation." Not just mercy, intention, not just survival, fruitfulness. In the same breath that God calls Isaac the child of promise, he names Ishmael a patriarch of kings. The number 12 echoes through both destinies. Jacob would later have 12 sons. Ishmael would too. And though one family would carry the line of the Messiah, the other would still carry the weight of divine blessing. The number 12 in Scripture signals order, authority, divine government. It appears in the tribes of Israel, the foundation stones of the New Jerusalem, and the apostles of Christ. But it first appears in the sons of Ishmael. This was not coincidence. It was covenant. Not the central covenant of redemption, but a covenant of legacy. A testimony that God's purposes extend beyond the borders we build around our blessings. These 12 sons were not shadows of Jacob's line. They were leaders, rulers, tribes in their own right. They were part of a parallel, unfolding a twin inheritance, one spiritual, one geopolitical. The world would know Israel through covenant and Ishmael through empire. And yet beneath both was the fingerprint of the same God. Perhaps the greater mystery is not why God blessed Ishmael, but why we so quickly forgot that he did. The desert remembers what the cities forget, and in its silence, the voice of God still speaks. Naming the sons, prophetic echoes in each tribe. In the stillness of Genesis 25, a list appears. Simple, unadorned, a genealogy easily passed over, yet within it lies the blueprint of nations. The 12 sons of Ishmael, each name a seed, each syllable a story. Nebaioth, Kedar, Adbil, Mibsam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Hadad, Tema, Jedur, Naphish, Kedema. These are not merely ancient names lost to time. They are prophetic markers, echoes of destinies forged in wilderness heat and shaped by divine hearing. Nebaioth, the firstborn, whose name may imply heights or fruitfulness, is remembered in Isaiah's prophecy as one who offers flocks upon God's altar. Kedar, dark and fierce, becomes a symbol of nomadic strength mentioned by both prophets and poets. Duma, whose name means silence, later becomes a metaphor for judgment. Tema, an oasis name, reflects not just location, but provision in barren places. Some names hint at struggle. Others suggest burden or divine message. Massa means oracle. Mishma is hearing. Adbil is disciplined by God. These are not random. They are spiritual fingerprints. And while the sons of Jacob tell the story of covenant, the sons of Ishmael reveal the divine poetry of those living outside the sanctuary, yet still under God's sky. The Hebrew roots of these names resonate like thunder hidden behind clouds. Words like burden, silence, vision, judgment, and hearing swirl around them. In the ancient world, to name was to declare. These names were not passive titles. They were declarations of destiny. Over time, these names would attach to cities, tribes, and regions across Arabia and beyond. They would appear in Assyrian records, in Nabatean trade, in the architecture of forgotten empires. But before they became territories, they were testimonies. Each name is a reminder that even outside the chosen line, God was still speaking. He was still guiding, and he was still planting purpose in the wilderness. And perhaps the most unsettling truth of all is this. While we remember the names of Jacob's sons through tribes and banners, we forget the sons of Ishmael, though their footprints still mark the desert paths and their stories are not yet finished. The names still cry out from the sand, and heaven still hears what we choose to forget. Territories of the 12, tracing the lost map. If names are echoes, then geography is shadow. The sons of Ishmael did not merely exist, they moved. They claimed land. They carved their presence into the soil of history. Genesis tells us that they dwelt from Havilah to Shur, from Egypt to Assyria, a vast corridor of ancient trade, exile, and revelation. This was not accidental. The wilderness became their canvas. The Arabian Peninsula, stretching from modern-day Saudi Arabia to Oman, from the Gulf of Aqaba to the Red Sea, bore their camps, their caravans, their cities. Names like Kedar and Tema appear in the writings of Assyrian kings. Duma is marked in the ruins of Nabatean strongholds. Tribes like Jetur and Naphish would one day war with the Israelites east of the Jordan. They inhabited the in-between, not quite promised land, not quite exile. They lived in the seams of empires, flourishing not despite the desert, but because of it. Their knowledge of water, wind, and stars made them guides of the ancient world, traders of incense, gold, and spices, guardians of sacred routes between Babylon and Egypt, between Mecca and Damascus. Over time, some were absorbed, others vanished, but the lines remained like footprints on a shifting dune. The Ishmaelite tribes were not unified by a king, but by a promise, a wilderness promise, that even here, far from altars and temples, God had marked a people for increase. To map their movement is to map the breath of a God who fills every land. To trace their lands is to realize that no space is too desolate for destiny, and no desert too vast for divine memory. The wind carries more than dust. It carries names, paths, and the memory of a blessing too easily dismissed. And if we listen closely, we may still hear their stories carried on that same wind. Clash and convergence, Ishmael and Israel through time. Blood does not always bring unity. Sometimes it carries the weight of division. From the moment Ishmael and Isaac drew breath from different mothers, their destinies were tangled in contrast. One born of promise, one born for longing. One remained in the tent, the other was sent into the wild. But the tension between these sons would not end with them. It would echo through generations. In the book of Genesis, Ishmael is seen mocking Isaac. A moment brief, in verse yet heavy with implication. Paul would later use this image to symbolize the war between flesh and spirit. But was it only mockery, or was it pain? A child sensing displacement, a firstborn witnessing his inheritance handed to another. Ishmael's exile was not only geographical, it was spiritual. It marked him as other. And yet the lines between the brothers were never fully severed. In Genesis 37, when Joseph is thrown into a pit by his brothers, it is a caravan of Ishmaelites who take him into Egypt. Some texts refer to them as Midianites, others as Ishmaelites. This overlap suggests more than historical confusion. It hints at an enduring connection, a convergence of identities. The tribe of Simeon, one of Jacob's own sons, is said to have intermarried with the descendants of Mishma, Ishmael's son. In 1 Chronicles, the record is subtle but clear. The chosen line was not sealed from the blood of the wilderness. They mingled, they merged. And through these quiet alliances, the descendants of Ishmael re-entered the sacred story not as enemies but as kin. Later still, the Hagrites, descendants of Hagar, appear as warriors in the eastern lands. Psalm 83 lists them among the enemies of Israel, yet they are also part of the same family tree. Even in enmity, there is a shared origin, a shared ache. Tradition whispers of Ishmael repenting, of him returning to bury his father Abraham alongside Isaac, a moment of reconciliation, of honoring the one who bore them both. Islam, too, elevates Ishmael not as a rival, but as a prophet, a builder of the Kaaba, a son not rejected, but revered. The story is not clean. It is layered, pain and honor, division and reunion. And perhaps that is the mystery, that the same God who called Isaac chosen also heard Ishmael cry. That sacred history is not drawn in straight lines, but in circles that fold back upon themselves. In the spaces where these circles touch, something holy stirs. A reminder that even the rejected are never outside the reach of redemption. And that sometimes the truest inheritance is not the one we receive, but the one we forgive. Ishmael and Islam, the reclaimed legacy. In the Christian and Jewish imagination, Ishmael often fades into the background, a side character, a symbol, but in Islam he stands in the light, as a prophet, a patriarch, a bridge between earth and heaven. His legacy is not silence, it is foundation. The Quran speaks of Ishmael alongside Abraham rebuilding the Kaaba in Mecca, a sacred act, a holy stone, a structure that becomes the center of Islamic faith. Here Ishmael is not wandering, he is anchoring, not exiled, but exalted. Muslim tradition traces many Arab tribes, including the tribe of Quraysh, directly to Ishmael through Kedar, his second son. This lineage is not myth. It is genealogy carried in names, in rituals, in language. It is a lived inheritance, one that places Ishmael not outside the covenant, but at the heart of divine movement through another path. This reclamation is not only cultural, it is spiritual. It says that blessing was never limited to one tent, one temple, one tongue. That God's hearing extends across deserts and into cities, into stories written not in Hebrew alone, but in Arabic and Aramaic, and the silent cry of forgotten blood. The Ishmael of Islam is not the wild man of Genesis. He is obedient, devout, a son who helps his father fulfill God's command, the son who submits not to exile, but to purpose. This reimagining may challenge some, but it also invites reflection. What if both images are true? What if Ishmael was both exiled and blessed, both wild and willing, both outside the covenant of Israel and inside the mystery of God's unfolding plan for the nations? In Ishmael's reclamation lies a sacred tension. The same son seen as rejected by some is embraced by others. And in that tension, a deeper truth emerges, that God is bigger than our boundaries, that His promises ripple through the world in ways we often do not expect. And so Ishmael rises again, not just in memory, but in faith, not just in history, but in prophecy. A son once cast, out now remembered by millions in prayer, in pilgrimage, in bloodline. And in his rise, we are forced to ask, what other legacies have we misread? What other sons have we silenced, only to find them still speaking across centuries? The desert is not empty. It is filled with voices we thought had vanished. Tribal transformations. Where did the 12 go? Time does not erase. It transforms. And the sons of Ishmael, once named and numbered, began to fade not in disappearance, but in diffusion. They did not vanish from history. They became it. Like water poured into desert soil, their presence seeped into other tribes, other tongues, other territories. Some rose to prominence. Others were swallowed by the empires they once traversed. The Nabateans, with their carved cities and incense roads, are often linked to Nebaioth and Kedar. Their script, their trade, their resilience in stone speak of a lineage both ancient and enduring. Traders, warriors, kings, and nomads. These were not fading tribes. They were shifting mirrors of a promise too vast for any single border. The Midianites, the Edomites, the Amalekites, the Hagrites, many of these shared bloodlines with Ishmael's descendants. The scriptures themselves acknowledge this overlap. In some cases, Ishmaelite and Midianite become interchangeable. In others, Israelite tribes like Simeon intermarry with Mishma's line. In these tangled roots, genealogy and prophecy converge. By the time of the prophets, some Ishmaelite names become synonymous with powerful Arabian clans. Isaiah speaks of Kedar's flocks. Jeremiah laments Duma's silence. These are not distant footnotes. They are living echoes. Their presence shaped trade routes, influenced wars, and framed the cultural memory of the ancient Near East. But like many who live on the margins, their identity began to blur. Absorbed by Arab confederations, merged into broader Semitic identities, hidden in the sands of time and the politics of empire. Yet still their story lingers not as lost, but as scattered. And so we look to the wilderness not for monuments, but for movements. For names that reappear in inscriptions, in ruins, in oral traditions passed through generations. The sons of Ishmael became part of the foundation beneath civilizations. And though their faces changed, their promise did not. For what God blesses cannot be undone, only reformed, only reseated in places we do not expect. Even when the world forgets their names, heaven remembers the bloodline. They became less visible, not less valuable. And in their transformation, we are reminded that not all legacies are meant to be preserved in stone. Some are carried in wind. Symbolism of the wilderness, the spiritual archetype of Ishmael. The wilderness is more than geography. It is metaphor. It is testing ground. It is the space between exile and revelation. And in Scripture, it is Ishmael's home. Not by choice, but by design. For God does not speak to everyone in temples. Some hear him best in barren places. When Hagar fled into the desert, it was not her end. It was her encounter. The wilderness became the place where God saw her, where he heard her, where he named her son. And from that moment, Ishmael's legacy was intertwined with the sacred symbolism of dry places and divine presence. Ishmael is the wilderness archetype, the child who grows in hardship, the man who survives with no altar, no priesthood, no sanctuary. He becomes the image of those who live without favor, but not without fire, of those shaped not by ritual, but by raw encounter. Throughout Scripture, the wilderness is a place of refining. Moses meets God there. Elijah flees there. John the Baptist preaches there. Even Jesus is driven into it. And yet Ishmael lived there. It was not his season. It was his setting. In this, Ishmael becomes something larger than genealogy. He becomes the spiritual type of the outsider whom God still guides. The son whose prayers are not recorded, but whose cries are heard. The man who does not build a nation around a temple, but carries a promise in his footsteps. His story reminds us that God is not confined to systems of worship, that he walks through deserts, that he speaks to outcasts, that he blesses those who have no altar with wells in the wilderness. And when we read his story, we are forced to ask what wilderness in our own lives might be holy ground in disguise. What barren places might still be echoing with divine promises. What rejected things might still carry sacred weight. The wilderness is not the end of the story. Sometimes it is the only place where the story truly begins. A tale of two sons, Isaac and Ishmael, reconsidered two sons, two mothers, one father, one promise. From the very beginning, Isaac and Ishmael have stood as symbols of contrast. One is born through miracle, the other through human initiative, one through Sarah, one through Hagar. Yet both are shaped by Abraham's longing. Both are wrapped in covenant tension. And both are loved. The Apostle Paul would later write in his letter to the Galatians that Ishmael represents the flesh and Isaac the spirit. He speaks of Hagar as Mount Sinai, of bondage of law, and Isaac, born of Sarah, as the child of promise and freedom. But even Paul, while speaking in metaphor, acknowledges the real. Ishmael was not fiction. He was not sin incarnate. He was Abraham's son, and God heard him. It is too simple to make Isaac the hero and Ishmael the castaway. The scripture is far more nuanced, for even when Sarah demands the departure of Hagar and her child, Abraham is deeply grieved. He does not rejoice in Ishmael's removal. He mourns it. And God, in his tenderness, does not erase Ishmael. He assures Abraham that Ishmael will become a great nation, a father of 12 princes, a man whose future is not abandoned. And here the story touches something deeper. For Isaac and Ishmael do not merely represent two brothers, they represent two aspects of human experience. The one welcomed into the promise, the one waiting on the edges of it, the one at the table, the one in the wilderness. And yet both are seen, both are spoken to, both are named by God. In Jewish tradition, there are whispers that Ishmael returned to help bury Abraham, that in death the two brothers stood side by side, that even after separation, blood remembered blood. In this image, we see something holy, a healing not written in law, but etched into memory. Isaac would carry the seed that led to Israel. Ishmael would carry the breath that echoed through Arabia. Both sons of Abraham, both walking under the same stars, both watched by the same God. And so we return to the question, what does it mean when the one who was sent away is still heard? What does it mean when both paths, though different, lead back to the same grave, the same beginning, the same God? The division was real, but so was the blessing. And perhaps that is the mystery we are left to hold, that God's story is big enough for both. In the shadow of these two sons, the ground between rejection and redemption begins to feel thin. And we are left standing between them, wondering what promises we have forgotten to remember. In the story of Ishmael and his 12 sons, we are reminded that the silence of Scripture does not always mean absence. Sometimes it means mystery, a deeper thread woven just beneath the surface. The 12 tribes of Ishmael were not forgotten by God. They were formed in the wilderness, shaped by hardship, blessed without altar, and scattered like seeds across the sands of time. Their journey reveals something sacred. That divine purpose is not always loud. It is not always centered. Sometimes it grows on the margins, in the places we overlook, in the names we pass over, in the people we dismiss too quickly. Ishmael's legacy teaches us that God hears the cries of those cast aside, that he blesses even when others reject, that his promises are not limited to one tent, one temple, or one tradition. We live in a world that still draws hard lines between chosen and castaway. But Scripture shows us a God who steps across those lines, who hears from the wilderness, who blesses 12 princes we rarely name, who remembers the first son even as he builds a covenant through the second. And so, the question lingers. What other promises have we buried beneath the weight of our assumptions? What names have we left unread? What voices has God heard that we have failed to listen to? Thank you for joining us in this sacred exploration. If this journey stirred something within you, if it opened a new window into the story of faith, we invite you to like this video and share it with others, seeking deeper truth. Subscribe to this channel for more biblical investigations like this one, where forgotten lines are traced and hidden meanings are revealed. And we would love to hear your thoughts. What stood out to you about the 12 tribes of Ishmael? What questions remain? Share your insight in the comments and help us build a community rooted in reflection and discovery. Because sometimes the greatest mysteries are not the ones we cannot find, but the ones we never thought to search for.